Claire Bennett had just set the hot soup on the table when Mark looked at her with eyes that felt strangely unfamiliar and said that from today on, he no longer wanted to feel like he was the only one carrying their marriage. The kitchen went silent at once. Not the gentle silence of a winter evening in Denver. It was the kind of silence that made the sound of a spoon touching the side of a bowl feel sharp enough to cut. Steam was still rising from the pot of soup, carrying the scent of butter, onions, and rosemary. On the table, Claire had already placed 2 plates, 2 glasses of water, 1 neatly folded napkin, and a small cake she had bought on her way home to celebrate Mark's promotion. She had thought this night would be memorable for a better reason. Mark Bennett had just become the regional operations director of a major logistics company. After months of pressure, rounds of evaluations, and presentation after presentation, he had finally reached the position he had always said he deserved. Claire had seen him exhausted, anxious, sleepless, irritable. And as always, she had quietly stood behind him. She edited his presentation. She reread every important email. She set reminders for his meetings. She prepared dinner when he forgot to eat. She let him believe he still had everything under control, even when she was the one quietly keeping everything from falling apart. But when Mark came home that night, the first person he thought about was not the woman who had walked with him through the hardest stretch. He thought about control. His dark blue tie was still around his neck. His shirt was still crisp. His watch caught the light beneath the kitchen lamp. Mark sat down, did not touch the cake, did not say thank you, only exhaled like a man who had just signed an important decision in a conference room. He said, "Claire, I think we need to reevaluate everything. I am moving forward in my career, but our life is still the same. I do not want to feel like I am the only one pulling both of us ahead." Claire was still standing beside the sink. Her hand was still holding the dish towel. For 1 second, she thought she had heard him wrong, not because the words were too loud, but because they were too calm. Mark said them in the voice of a man who believed he was making a reasonable observation, not hurting the woman who had lived beside him for 8 years. She did not answer right away. Mark looked at her silence and misunderstood it. He thought she was confused. He thought she had no argument. He thought he had finally said the thing they both knew, but she had never dared to face. In his mind, the promotion was like a medal. It made him feel taller, steadier, more right. He did not see that the light from that medal was casting a shadow over the person standing beside him. He continued, "I think we should live more fairly. Clearer expenses, clearer responsibilities. I do not want to keep paying for things when I do not even know if everything is truly balanced." The word balanced almost made Claire laugh, but her throat went dry. Balanced. For 8 years, she had learned how to balance a life that Mark only ever saw after it had been arranged. She balanced utility bills so he would not have to worry after business trips. She balanced the family calendar so his mother would not feel forgotten. She balanced meals, medicine, gifts, phone calls, messages, exhaustion, the days he came home disappointed with work, the nights he feared he was not good enough. She even balanced his self-respect by never telling anyone how much he had needed her. And now, he was calling that silence a lack of contribution. In Mark's mind, everything seemed simple. He earned more. He had a bigger title. He was the one who had just been recognized by the company. Claire only taught part-time at the Community Education Center and took on a few online editing projects he had never asked about in detail. To him, her work seemed soft, flexible, not like something someone had to fight for. He did not know that every curriculum she wrote had helped adult learners begin their lives again. He did not know that an education organization in Boulder was negotiating to purchase the rights to use her materials. He certainly did not know that inside the silver laptop on her desk, there was a folder filled with drafts, contracts, and proof that Claire had never been standing still behind him. She had simply never turned her value into a weapon. That was what Mark did not understand, and it was also what would surprise him the most. Claire set the towel down. Her movement was slow, very slow, as if she was putting down not just a piece of cloth, but a roll she had worn for too long. When she turned around, her eyes were not red, not wet, not trembling. It was that calmness that made something strange pass through Mark, though he quickly brushed it aside. He thought calm meant agreement. Claire asked, "Do you want real fairness?" Mark nodded almost immediately. "Yes, I think it is time." She looked at the man in front of her, the man who had held her hand when they first moved to Denver, and said that as long as they had each other, it would be enough. The man who had once fallen asleep at the dining table because he was so overwhelmed during his first year at work. The man who had leaned on her so heavily that she had mistaken that trust for love. But now, standing before her, he no longer saw the person who had kept him steady. He only saw a number that had not been calculated the way he wanted. Claire heard Margaret's voice inside Mark's words. His mother had always believed that a successful man needed to control his home. She had never directly called Claire someone who lived off him. She only used softer, sharper sentences. A woman should know her place. A good wife helps her husband rise. Men carry burdens of their own. Over time, those sentences had settled into Mark like fine dust, invisible at first, until they finally covered the way he looked at his wife. Claire understood. But understanding did not mean continuing to endure. She walked to the table and sat down across from Mark. The soup between them was beginning to cool. The thin layer of steam dissolved slowly into the warm yellow light. The kitchen was still beautiful, still tidy, still warm, but the thing that had once made it feel like home was beginning to pull away from Mark, little by little, even though he had not realized it yet. Claire said, "If you want fairness, then we will be fair. Rent will be split according to what we agree on. Bills will be recorded clearly. Whoever uses the food pays for it. Housework will be divided again. Whoever invites guests prepares for them. Whoever has family events remembers them. Your schedule will be your responsibility. Your work will be your responsibility. And the things that do not come with receipts will no longer keep disappearing automatically in my hands." Mark frowned slightly. He did not like the way the list kept growing. When he said fairness, he had only meant money. He had never imagined that fairness could touch morning coffee, ironed shirts, phone calls to his mother, birthday gifts for his sister, or the presentations Claire edited for him at midnight. But he had spoken too far to step back now. He answered, "Fine. If you want clarity, then we will have clarity." Claire looked at him. "No, Mark, this is what you wanted. I am only making it complete." That sentence changed the rhythm of the room. Mark heard the difference, but did not fully understand it. He only felt something slip out of his hands. Not power, not love, but the invisible comfort he had assumed he deserved. He tried to smile, but the smile never reached his eyes. He said everything would be better. That transparency was mature, that maybe this was a necessary step for both of them. He spoke like a man trying to reassure himself more than convince his wife. Claire did not argue. She only nodded, because she knew this lesson could not be taught with words. It had to be lived. That night, Mark ate very little. He said he was tired from a long day. He went to bed early, believing he had just established a new order. In his mind, Claire would be upset for a few days, then tired, then return to her old habits. He believed people like her always needed to be needed. He did not know Claire had outgrown that feeling a long time ago. When the bedroom door closed, Claire sat alone in the living room. The city of Denver outside the window lay beneath a layer of cold light. Far away, the mountains disappeared into darkness, silent and steady, like a reminder that some things do not need to be loud to have weight. She opened her laptop. In her private folder beside the curriculum contract and the edited version of Mark's presentation, there was a note she had written weeks earlier. "If one day he thinks I am a burden, do not argue. Let him see what has been holding him up." Claire read that line for a long time. Her heart still hurt. She did not deny that, but beneath the pain was a new kind of calm, deep and solid, like the ground after rain. Tomorrow, Mark would wake up in the same house, but that house would no longer run the way it used to. Not because Claire wanted to hurt him, but because she had finally understood that love did not mean disappearing so someone else could feel stronger. And in this story, the person who had been underestimated the most had never been the weakest one. The next morning, Mark woke up, but everything familiar had quietly shifted out of place. There was no smell of coffee drifting from the kitchen, no shirt hanging ready outside the closet, no lunchbox placed beside the car keys, no sound of Claire reminding him that his first meeting began at 9 o'clock. Everything was still there: the kitchen, the table, the refrigerator, the coffee machine, the basket of clean laundry. But the care that had once flowed through those things had vanished like water pulling away from a riverbed. Mark stood in the middle of the kitchen, one hand holding his phone, the other running through his still messy hair. He had not yet understood why an ordinary morning could make him feel so out of place. In his mind, last night's decision had only been a change in principle. He wanted more clarity, more balance. He wanted to feel that his role was being recognized. He had not expected that clarity to begin with an empty cup. Claire sat by the window, a cup of hot tea in front of her, and her silver laptop open on the table. Denver's winter light fell across her shoulders, pale and cold, making her face look calmer than calm. She was not trying to seem distant. She was simply no longer rushing to fill the emptiness for someone else. Mark opened a cabinet, then closed it. He stared at the coffee machine as if it were a brand new appliance. "Where's the coffee?" he asked. Claire finished typing a line, saved her document, then finally looked up. "The coffee beans are on the top shelf. The machine is still where it always is." The answer was not harsh, but it was clear as a line drawn across the floor. Mark heard that line. He wanted to say she was moving too fast, that it had only been one night, that husband and wife did not need to be this cold with each other, but he could not say it without hearing the contradiction in his own voice. He was the one who had asked for fairness. He was also the one who wanted each person to be responsible for their own part. He quietly opened the cabinet, poured in too many beans, pressed the wrong button, waited longer than usual. When the thick, dark coffee finally ran into the cup, he grimaced before he even drank it. Claire saw everything, but she said nothing. Mark's phone rang at that exact moment. Margaret Bennett's name appeared on the screen. Claire did not need to look twice. Mark's mother always called whenever she felt her son was crossing an important threshold. She did not call simply to check in. She called to guide, to reinforce, to remind Mark that his success had to be protected from anything she considered weak. Mark answered, and his voice softened immediately. "Mom." Claire looked down at her screen, but her ears caught every pause. The apartment was quiet enough to make every sound clearer. Margaret's voice on the other end was sharp, concise, and full of the confidence of someone used to being listened to. "How is the first day after the promotion?" she asked. "Does it feel different yet?" Mark glanced toward Claire. "I'm fine. I talked to Claire last night." A brief silence followed. Claire could almost picture Margaret sitting at her breakfast table, one hand around her coffee cup, back straight, eyes satisfied. "Good," Margaret said. "When a man steps into a bigger position, he has to learn how to keep his life in order. Marriage needs order too. No one can go far if everything remains unclear." Mark nodded, even though his mother could not see him. "I just want everything to be fairer." "Fair is right," Margaret replied. "A mature wife will understand that. If she truly contributes, she will not be afraid of clarity." The word clarity rang through the kitchen like a spoon dropping onto stone. Claire placed her hand around her cup of tea. The heat moved through her palm, keeping her anchored in the present. She did not hate Margaret. The truth was more complicated than that. Margaret was not a cruel woman. She had worked hard, carried the family flower shop through difficult years, handled the house, the children, the bills, the relatives, all with her own hands. But all her life, she had believed that real value belonged only to the person whose name was on the paperwork, the person with the title, the person who brought money home in the most visible way. She had once been overlooked. Then she learned to respect the very kind of power that had overlooked her. And now, whether she meant to or not, she was passing that way of seeing on to Mark. Claire understood the root of the problem, but she no longer used understanding to erase her own hurt. While Mark listened to his mother, an email appeared on Claire's screen. It was from a representative of the community education program in Boulder. They confirmed that her study skills curriculum had been selected for the spring project. They wanted to expand the contract, inviting her to serve as a content consultant for the first 3 months, with the possibility of renewal if the program performed well. Claire read each line slowly. No one in that kitchen knew that in that very moment the woman being underestimated had just stepped through a new professional door. There was no applause, no congratulations, no shining title pinned to a crisp shirt, but it was real achievement. It was the night she wrote lesson plans after cleaning the kitchen. The morning she revised lessons before Mark woke up. The competence she had built quietly without needing to make noise in order to exist. That was Claire's real power. Mark ended the call after a few minutes. He put the phone down, took a sip of the coffee he had made himself, and immediately frowned. The bitterness bothered him, but Claire's eyes made him even more uncomfortable. She was not looking at him like a defeated person. She was looking at him like someone who had already seen the whole board. He pulled out a chair and sat down. "I think we should go to the credit union this afternoon," he said. "Let's make this clear right away. Separate the accounts, set up the shared expenses again." Claire closed her laptop. "You want to make everything official?" Mark nodded. "I think it will be better for both of us. Rent, utilities, internet, shared household items, half each. Personal expenses are each person's own responsibility." Claire was silent for a few seconds. In that silence, she remembered all the things Mark did not list. Margaret's birthday gift, the call to check on Harold, the card sent to Sophie, her father-in-law's medical appointment, family dinners, the messages that softened the air whenever her mother-in-law was displeased. Those things never appeared on a bill, so in Mark's eyes, they had never carried any weight. She said, "Fine, but if we are splitting finances, then we are also splitting family responsibilities." Mark tilted his head slightly. "What do you mean?" "I mean gifts for your mother, you remember them and prepare them yourself. Calls to your father, you schedule them yourself. Sophie's birthday, you plan it yourself. If you invite guests, you handle the meal. If you have a meeting on your calendar, you check it yourself. If your documents need editing, you prepare them in advance." Mark set his cup down harder than necessary, but he still held himself back. He did not want to turn the morning into an argument. Part of him found her request reasonable. Another part of him felt as though he was losing something he had never admitted he had. "Claire, I am just talking about money." "I know," she replied, "but marriage does not only spend money, it also spends time, memory, and attention. If you want fairness, we cannot only count the part that is easiest to see." Mark looked at her. For the first time since the night before, he felt something slipping outside of his plan. He had expected Claire to object to separating the accounts. He had prepared himself for tears, for anger, for long explanations, but she did none of that. She agreed too quickly, too clearly, and expanded the meaning of fairness into places he had never inventoried. He said, "Fine, if that is what you want." Claire looked straight into his eyes. "No, Mark, this is what you want. I am only making sure it is not missing half of itself." The sentence silenced him. A thin unease passed over his face and disappeared. Mark still had enough pride not to admit that he had just been placed in front of a new door, but deep inside he began to hear the hinges move. He stood up, rushing to get ready for work. Because Claire did not remind him, he forgot the black folder on the shelf beside the door. Claire saw it. Very clearly, that folder contained the materials for an important meeting that afternoon. Before, she would have called him back immediately, even run after him into the hallway if she had to. Today she did not. Not to embarrass him, not to punish him. But because she had handed back to him the part of responsibility he said he wanted. 10 minutes later, her phone rang. "Do you see my black folder anywhere?" Mark asked, his voice hurried. Claire looked at it on the shelf. "Yes, it is beside the door. Why didn't you remind me?" The question came out so naturally that both of them heard exactly where the problem was. Claire answered slowly, "Because your memory cannot stay in my list of responsibilities forever." The other end went silent. Then Mark said he would come back to get it. Claire put the phone down. She opened the email from Boulder again, read the contract details carefully, and saved it into her private folder. On the screen, her name appeared on the line for content lead. Not Mark's wife, not the person behind someone else. Claire Bennett. Outside the window, morning sunlight spread thinly over the city. She stood up, washed her own teacup, dried it, and placed it back exactly where it belonged. Only her own cup. That afternoon, they would go to the credit union. Mark thought it was where he would begin taking control of his life again. Claire knew it was where he would begin to see what life was really made of. That afternoon, Mark drove to Mile High Community Credit Union with the face of a man who believed he was on his way to rearrange his life in a more mature way. Claire sat in the passenger seat, silently watching the city of Denver slide past the window. Buildings were covered in the gray light of late afternoon, bare trees lined the streets, and hurried streams of cars moved along the road as if pulling everyone toward somewhere called home. But for Claire, the word home no longer felt simple today. It was no longer just the warm kitchen, the dining table, the soft routines, and the small things done before anyone even realized they needed to be done. Since last night, home had become a question. And that afternoon, Mark thought he would find the answer in numbers. He still did not understand that numbers were only the first door. Mile High Community Credit Union stood on a quiet street corner, its large glass front reflecting the sky as it changed color. Inside, soft white lights, the smell of fresh paper, and polished wood created a feeling of cleanliness, order, and trust. The place was designed to make people believe that everything could be solved with signatures, forms, and transparency. Mark walked in first. His shoulders were straight, his chin slightly lifted. He wore a charcoal coat, holding the black folder he had been forced to return home for that morning. Now the folder rested under his arm like a small reminder, but he tried not to think about it. He wanted to believe he was still in control of this story. Claire followed half a step behind him. She did not lower her head. She was not tense. She did not look weak. Inside her handbag was a thin folder holding old statements, a few notes, and a list of expenses she had recorded herself for months. Mark did not know that. He only saw his quiet wife and mistook that quietness for something he could still lean on. Their financial consultant was Nora Whitaker, a woman in her 40s with brown hair pinned low, thin-framed glasses, and a voice that was low and steady. She invited them into a small room with frosted glass walls. On the table sat a tray of pens, a computer screen, 2 glasses of water, and a neat stack of blank forms waiting to be filled out. Nora smiled politely. "How would you like to adjust the joint account today?" Mark answered immediately, almost without looking at Claire. "We want to separate the accounts, split the current balance evenly. Shared expenses will be contributed to more clearly from now on." Nora nodded and began typing. She asked about rent, electricity, water, internet, apartment insurance, and the monthly automatic payments. At first, Mark answered quickly, but the deeper the questions went, the slower his voice became. "What is the name of your current internet plan?" Nora asked. Mark stopped. Claire answered, "Alpine Net, family plan." Nora continued typing. "When does the electricity payment usually come out?" Mark looked down at his folder, as if the answer might be hidden inside it. Claire said, "The first Tuesday of every month." "Which email receives the apartment insurance notices?" Claire answered, "Mine." Mark sat still. A faint heat spread up the back of his neck. Nora's questions were not meant to make him uncomfortable. She was only doing her job, but it was exactly that ordinary professionalism that made everything painfully clear. Mark had said he was carrying this life, and yet within a few minutes, he could not answer the basic questions about how that life actually worked. Claire did not look at him with accusation. That made it even harder to bear. If she had looked at him like he was guilty, he could have defended himself. But she only looked at Nora and answered each question with the precision of someone who had been doing this for too long to even need to think. Nora turned the screen slightly. "The current joint account balance can be divided into 2 equal parts. After that, the 2 of you can set up automatic transfers into a shared expense account if you would like to keep one account for fixed costs." Mark nodded. "Yes, that is what we want. Everything clear, half each." Claire turned to him. "Half the money?" she said. "What about the time?" Mark stiffened slightly. "Claire, we are at a bank." She looked at him calmly. "Yes. And this is where you wanted clarity to begin, so I want that clarity to be complete." Nora's hands paused for the briefest moment. She did not interfere, but her eyes moved from Mark to Claire as if she understood that this was not just a meeting to separate an account. This was a marriage being placed on the table in a way that, until now, only one person had been forced to see. Claire continued, her voice even, neither loud nor sharp. If we split expenses, we also need to record responsibilities. Who buys shared household items? Who manages payment deadlines? Who prepares meals? Who cleans? Who remembers family occasions? Who schedules repairs? Who spends time doing things that do not come with receipts, but if they are not done, the whole house becomes chaotic? Mark looked at Nora, then at Claire. He did not want to discuss those things here, not because they were unrelated, but because they were far too related. He felt himself being pulled from a simple conversation about money into an area he had never prepared himself to enter. He said, "Fine, if you want to track it, we can track it at home." Claire nodded. "I want copies of the recurring payments and the last 18 months of statements." Mark turned to her. "What do you need those for?" "To know where we are starting from." That answer landed in the middle of the table, light but firm. Nora printed the necessary documents. The printer hummed steadily in the small room. Page after page slid out, white and cold, carrying numbers Mark had never looked at closely. He had always seen the joint account like a cloudy lake, knowing money came in and money went out, but never bending down to examine the currents beneath. Claire had lived inside those currents every day. When Nora placed the stack of papers in front of them, Claire took a dark green folder from her bag and carefully placed each page inside. Mark watched the movement, and for the first time that day, something became clear enough to unsettle him. Claire had not come here to react to his decision. She had prepared for it. Nora handed them the forms to sign. Mark signed first. His signature was fast, strong, slightly slanted. Claire signed after him. Her signature was neat, slow, steady. The two signatures sat on the same page, but they no longer carried the same meaning. To Mark, it was proof that he had reset fairness. To Claire, it was the starting point of a lesson he still did not know he was part of. After the paperwork was complete, Nora explained how to set up automatic transfers and suggested they could use a shared expense tracker. Mark almost immediately said there was no need to make it complicated. Claire said there was. Nora handed her a simple template. Claire accepted it and thanked her. Mark looked at that template, as if it were a door opening into a room full of things he did not want to clean. He was beginning to understand that fairness, once spoken out loud, would not stay neatly where someone wanted to place it. It would move into the kitchen, into the refrigerator, into the laundry basket, into the family calendar, into every place he had once believed had nothing to do with him. When the meeting ended, Mark walked ahead into the lobby to take a call from work. Claire stayed behind, buttoning her coat. Nora walked with her toward the door, then lowered her voice just enough that no one else could hear. "Are you sure you are okay?" Claire looked at the woman in front of her. There was no pity in Nora's eyes, only a quiet kind of concern, the kind that belonged to someone who had seen many women walk into financial rooms with calm faces while carrying a whole lifetime of exhaustion. Claire answered, "I am okay. I just do not want to keep living in a marriage where the part I do is only seen when I stop doing it." Nora nodded. She did not ask anything more. Some answers were already clear enough. Outside, the afternoon wind moved along the street. Mark stood beside the car, one hand holding his phone, the other tucked into his coat pocket. He still looked like the man who had just been promoted. Neat, successful, directed. But Claire looked at him differently now, not with contempt. She did not want to look down on the man she had once loved. She simply saw the empty space behind that steady appearance. The empty space she had been filling for far too long. On the way home, Mark tried to lighten the air. "I think this is good for both of us," he said. "If everything is clear, no one has to feel treated unfairly." Claire looked out the window. Headlights stretched into long streaks across the wet road. "Clarity is a good thing," she replied. Mark exhaled, thinking her answer meant the conversation was beginning to soften. He did not hear the rest of Claire's silence. Clarity was a good thing, but it was not always comfortable, especially for someone who had grown used to living off the things left blurry. When they got back to the apartment, Mark placed his keys on the table and took off his coat. He thought everything could begin tomorrow. Tomorrow always sounded easier. Tomorrow gave people the feeling that there was still time to prepare, still room to negotiate, still a chance to delay. But Claire took the expense tracking template from her bag and placed it on the dining table. Beside it, she placed the green folder. The movement was gentle, but the sound of paper touching wood made the room feel heavier. Mark looked at her. "Starting tonight?" Claire answered, "If fairness is the new principle, it does not need to wait until tomorrow." She picked up a pen and wrote the first line, "Start date." Then she looked up at Mark. "From now on, your dinner is your decision. If you use food from the refrigerator, write it down. If you order food, write it down. If you use shared items, write it down, not to compete, so that no one can keep pretending everything appears on its own." Mark stood still. This time he could no longer smile. He still did not understand the full lesson ahead, but he had felt its first edge touch him. Claire set the pen down. "You wanted to see fairness. Then we will begin by seeing everything." In the quiet kitchen, the blank sheet of paper lay in the middle of the table like a new mirror. And for the first time, Mark was not sure he would like the reflection staring back at him. In that mirror, there was no face of his, no crisp shirt, no new title, no image of the man who had just been promoted and believed he had finally taken hold of the order of his life. On that sheet of paper, there were only empty boxes. But it was those empty boxes that made him uncomfortable, because they were waiting to be filled with things he had never named. Claire set the pen beside the paper, then walked toward the refrigerator. She opened the door and took out a small glass container of vegetable soup she had cooked at noon, a box of salad, and a slice of rye bread neatly wrapped in parchment paper. Each item was just enough for one person. Nothing extra. No portion waiting for Mark. No second bowl placed out of habit. No gentle question asking whether he wanted to eat with her. Mark stood still, his eyes following every movement she made. It was not coldness. That was exactly what unsettled him. Claire did not shut the refrigerator harder than necessary. She did not deliberately make noise. She did not look at him like someone who had won. She was simply doing what she had said she would do. She was taking care of her own part, no longer automatically carrying his as well. But to Mark, that absence had a shape. It had the shape of a bowl that did not appear, a spoon that was not set down, a glass of water that was not poured, a napkin that was not folded for him beside a plate. Things too small to complain about, but too clear not to feel. After Claire sat down, he opened the refrigerator. It was full of food, but for the first time, he did not know what he could use without thinking. Claire's containers were neatly labeled. Vegetables had been washed, fish had been marinated, yogurt had been portioned. Everything looked like a small system she had quietly maintained for a long time. On the lower shelf, Mark found half a loaf of bread, a package of cheese, a few cans of sparkling water, and an old container of food he could not remember buying. He realized he was not hungry in the usual way. He was uncomfortable because convenience had moved away from him. In the end, he took out his phone and ordered food, a burger, fries, and a soda. The total after delivery fees was $31.80. The number on the screen made him frown, not because he could not afford it, but because for the first time, a quick, rushed, unremarkable dinner appeared as a specific cost. Before, dinner had appeared on the table as a natural part of the evening. He judged it by taste, not by time, ingredients, effort, and attention. Claire ate slowly. She did not look at his phone screen. But when Mark picked up the pen and wrote the first line in the tracker, she heard the pen press a little too firmly against the paper. Mark's dinner, delivery food, $31.80. He finished writing, then set the pen down as if he had just signed an unpleasant document. That night, there was no argument in the apartment, only long stretches of silence. Mark ate in the living room, but when he finished, the paper bag, the containers, and the napkins remained on the table. A part of him waited for them to disappear the way they always had. He was not waiting on purpose. He was simply used to not having to think about what came after a meal. Claire walked past him, carried her own glass into the kitchen, washed it clean, dried it, and placed it back on the shelf. She did not touch his trash. Mark watched her. "You are not going to clean up?" Claire turned back, her voice calm. "That was your dinner. One very short sentence. Not harsh, not confrontational." But it made Mark look down at the paper container in front of him as if he were understanding for the first time that even a small action had an after. He cleaned it up himself. Not gracefully, not quickly, but by himself. Behind the door of her office, Claire opened her laptop and read the email from Boulder again. They wanted her to attend the project introduction meeting the following week. Her name was written in the invitation as a content consultant. She stared at that line for a long time. Part of her wanted to walk outside, place the email in front of Mark, and tell him that the woman he underestimated had not been standing still. But she did not. Real power did not need to be thrown onto the table in anger. It only needed to exist, steady and undeniable, until the truth was ripe enough that no one could ignore it. The next morning, Mark woke up late. His phone had rung, but there had been no soft voice from Claire outside the door. No reminder that he had an early meeting. No ironed shirt hanging ready. No coffee in the pot. No lunchbox in the insulated bag. Mark sat up sharply when he saw the time, his heart beating fast because his first meeting of the day began at 9 o'clock. He rushed into the bathroom, brushed his teeth in a hurry, put on a still wrinkled shirt, and tied his tie crookedly. In the mirror, he was still Mark Bennett, Regional Operations Director, but the version of him that morning looked as if it was missing a layer of polish he had never known someone had been placing over him every day. Claire was already sitting at the dining table, drinking tea and reviewing teaching materials. Her handbag sat beside her chair. Her coat was folded neatly over it. A quiet readiness surrounded her, the complete opposite of Mark's hurry. He asked, "Why didn't you wake me?" Claire looked up. "Your alarm already did." Mark froze. The answer was not wrong. And because it was not wrong, he did not know how to respond. He wanted to say that husbands and wives were supposed to support each other, but that sentence, on that particular morning, sounded too much like someone who had asked for support to be withdrawn and was now complaining because he no longer received it. He made instant coffee because he did not have time to use the machine. It tasted thin, bitter, and harshly hot. He took one sip, then set it down. On his way out, he forgot his office access card. This time, he only noticed after reaching the parking garage, so he had to come back. Claire was still home. The card was sitting right on the shelf beside the door. He looked at her. She said nothing, and that silence was no longer an empty space. It was a boundary. At work, Mark walked into the meeting a few minutes late. No one said anything severe, but the senior supervisor glanced at the clock. Just one look was enough to make Mark uncomfortable. His presentation was not as smooth as usual. One chart was in the wrong order. One timeline had not been adjusted. One answer he thought he could deliver well became long and loose when someone asked a follow-up question. Suddenly, he remembered the nights Claire sat beside him, reading his drafts, cutting out unnecessary sentences, rearranging the main points, smoothing the transitions so his speech sounded more solid. He had once thought she was only helping for fun. Now, standing in front of the conference room, he could feel the difference between a presentation he had prepared alone and one she had quietly sharpened for him. No one in the room knew that, but Mark did. And that made him more unsettled than any comment could have. Meanwhile, Claire taught her morning class at the community center. The classroom was small, with white light, old desks, and a handful of adult learners trying to begin their education again. Claire taught slowly, clearly, patiently. An older woman named Rosa stayed after class to thank her because last week's lesson had helped her write her first job application letter. Claire smiled. The gratitude was not grand, but it touched her. Sometimes people outside the home saw her value more easily than the person who slept under the same roof every night. On his way home that afternoon, Mark stopped at the grocery store. He bought pasta, bottled sauce, sausage cookies, a slightly wilted bag of vegetables, 2 kinds of cereal, and a bottle of juice. He forgot toilet paper, forgot milk, forgot dish soap. When he placed the bags on the kitchen counter, he looked both tired and as if he wanted to be acknowledged. Claire glanced over the items. "Did you buy toilet paper?" Mark went silent. "Milk." He looked toward the bags. "Dish soap." He exhaled. Claire did not criticize him. She only said, "The things we need most are often not the things that catch our attention first." That sentence entered Mark more slowly than criticism but stayed longer. He had bought what was easy to see, easy to choose, easy to make him feel as if he was handling things. The things that actually kept the house running he had missed. Exactly the way he had once looked at their marriage. That night, he boiled pasta. The water spilled over onto the stove. The pasta clumped together. The sauce was too salty. Mark ate a few bites and said nothing. Claire sat on the other side of the table, eating the salad she had prepared for herself. The air no longer felt as cold as the first night, but it could not yet be called warm. It was like a room after the window had been left open too long, needing time to regain its heat. After dinner, Claire opened the tracker. She wrote her part in a few short lines. Mark looked at the grocery receipt, the messy stove, the pot that needed washing, then slowly wrote down his part. He asked, "Does this really need to continue?" Claire set the pen down. Yes, because when something is always done for someone, the person receiving it can easily start thinking it has no value. Mark did not answer. Outside the window, Denver lit up for the night. In the kitchen, Mark rolled up his sleeves, turned on the faucet, and began washing the pot stained with sauce. His movements were clumsy, slow, a little uncertain. But this time, Claire did not step in to help. She stood at the doorway to the living room, quietly listening to the sound of running water. That sound was not a victory. It was the first sound of a man beginning to touch the part of life he had never truly seen before. But one clumsily washed pot could not make a home fair. Claire knew that. Mark was beginning to feel it too, even if he did not yet have the courage to name it. The next morning, when the pale Denver light slipped through the curtains, the apartment was no longer stretched tight like a wire, but it had not softened either. It felt like a room after a heavy storm, everything still in its place, with only the dampness in the air reminding them that something had changed the night before. Claire woke up early. She made tea, opened her laptop, and created a new spreadsheet. The title appeared on the screen in simple words: Household Balance Tracker, a family balance tracking sheet. She did not choose that name to irritate Mark. She chose it because it was accurate. If a marriage wanted to talk about fairness, it needed enough room for the things that were not easy to see. Rent, electricity, water, internet, groceries, cleaning supplies, laundry, cleaning, repairs, meals, family gifts, appointments, preparation time, management time, person responsible, notes. Each column appeared like a small door opening into the life Claire had quietly walked through for years. Mark entered the kitchen while she was typing the first lines. He was already wearing a shirt, this time a little smoother because he had tried to iron it the night before. There was still a small crease near the cuff, but he did not notice. Or maybe he noticed and decided not to ask Claire. He looked at the screen and stopped. "You are really making a spreadsheet for this?" Claire did not look up right away. She finished entering the line for Mark's delivery dinner, the line for her dinner ingredients, and the line for the missing essential items from yesterday's shopping trip. Then she finally looked at him. Yes. Mark pulled out a chair and sat down, his face looking both tired and unwilling to admit he was tired. "Claire, I understand that we need more clarity, but do we really need to record every little thing like this?" Claire placed both hands on the table. "Small things only seem small when someone else does them for you." The sentence was not loud, but it was enough to silence Mark. He looked at the columns on the screen. They were not accusing him. They were simply waiting for data. That objectivity made him more uncomfortable than criticism would have. If Claire scolded him, he could say she was being emotional. But a spreadsheet had no emotion. It simply added up what people had once ignored. Claire began explaining slowly. Every expense needed to show who bought it, who used it, and whether it was shared. Every household task needed to show who did it, how long it took, and whether anything extra came up. If Mark bought the wrong item and had to buy it again, both purchases would be recorded. If Claire used her own ingredients, she would record her own portion, not to compete, but so no one could keep saying that this life balanced itself. Mark leaned back in his chair. Inside him, an old reaction still stirred. Part of him wanted to say this was too rigid. Part of him wanted to text Margaret so his mother could confirm that Claire was making too much of it. But Claire's voice that morning did not sound angry. It sounded tired from having to do something that should have been seen long ago, and that was what kept him from sending any message. That afternoon, Mark decided to go to the grocery store again. This time, he brought a list. He wrote toilet paper, milk, dish soap, vegetables, eggs, coffee, laundry detergent. The list was short and clear, and yet standing between the aisles, he still felt lost. There were too many kinds of milk, too many brands of dish soap, too many sizes of toilet paper. Before, the right things had always appeared in the house, so he had never known that the right thing was the result of memory, trial, price comparison, and experience. He got it almost right, but the milk was not the kind Claire usually used. The dish soap had a scent that was far too strong. The laundry detergent was made for a top-loading machine, while theirs was front-loading. When Claire looked at the items on the counter, she did not criticize him. She only said gently, "Next time, read the labels more carefully." There was nothing insulting in that sentence. But Mark still felt his face grow hot. He had managed an entire complex transportation team, and yet in a grocery store, he had been defeated by a detergent label. That night, the next lesson came from the washing machine. Mark gathered the clothes with a slightly rushed confidence. He wanted to prove he could do it. White shirts, colored clothes, a newly bought red towel, socks, a thin sweater, all of it went into the same load. He poured in the detergent, chose the quick cycle, and pressed start. The sound of the machine gave him a sense of relief. This did not seem too hard. 1 hour later, when he opened the machine, that relief disappeared. His pale blue shirt had turned a strange gray. A few white shirts had taken on a pink tint from the red towel. The sweater had shrunk, much smaller than before. Mark stood in front of the washing machine, holding the shirt in his hands, looking like a man who had just discovered a language he had never learned. Claire had just stepped out of her office. She saw everything: the red towel, the sweater, Mark's eyes searching for an explanation that would not cost him his pride. He said, "I did not know I was supposed to separate colors." Claire answered, "I know. Why didn't you tell me before?" The question came out too quickly. The moment he said it, Mark understood that he had exposed an old habit. He still expected Claire to predict his mistakes before he made them. Still expected her to stand between him and the consequences. Still expected the lesson to arrive without a cost. Claire looked at him. Her eyes were not cold, but they were very clear. "Because you did not ask, and because I have been doing it for years without you ever thinking you needed to learn." Mark looked down at the pile of clothes. This time, he did not argue. He only placed them into a separate basket, more slowly than before. Claire opened the spreadsheet and added a new line: "Damage from incorrect laundry. Person responsible, Mark." He looked at that line. A few days earlier, he would have called it petty, but now, standing in front of a load of discolored clothes, he could not. Every small mistake had a cost. Every lack of attention left a trace. And before this, Claire had paid many costs like that with time, not money. Night fell. The apartment was quiet. Claire sat at the dining table reviewing the content consulting contract from Boulder. Mark sat across from her, entering expenses into the spreadsheet. He typed slowly, put things in the wrong box, corrected them, sighed, then continued. The scene was very ordinary, but to Claire, it felt almost unfamiliar. For the first time, Mark was not only seeing the result of family life, he was touching its structure. Mark's phone lit up. A message from Margaret. "Is everything all right, son? Do not let money make things more tense than necessary." Mark looked at the message for a long time, before he would have answered immediately. He would have told her Claire was making too much of it. He would have let his mother give him a story in which he was the reasonable one and Claire was the difficult one. But tonight, behind him were the ruined clothes, the receipts for the wrong groceries, the open spreadsheet in front of him, and the memory of the questions he could not answer at the credit union. He locked the screen. He did not reply. Claire saw it. She did not ask, but she noticed. Not like a victory, like a small sign that Mark, for the first time, had chosen not to run to the place that always made him feel right. The next day, the spreadsheet became a silent character in the apartment. It did not speak, but it was present. Mark began noticing things he had never noticed before. Paper towels did not run out because they vanished on their own. The hand soap bottle did not stay full because it filled itself. The refrigerator did not stay organized because food knew how to arrange itself. The family calendar was not clear because events remembered where they belonged. Everything had someone seeing it first. And for far too long, that person had been Claire. By Friday evening, Mark sat alone in front of the spreadsheet. His total spending for the week was much higher than Claire's. Not because he lived extravagantly, but because he lacked experience. He bought the wrong thing, so he had to buy again. He forgot, so he paid for urgency. He did not prepare, so he paid extra fees. He did not know, so he chose the expensive option. Every small mistake showed up as a line of data. Claire walked into the kitchen and saw him still staring at the screen. He said, his voice lower than usual, "I used to think earning money was the heaviest part." Claire stopped. "And now?" Mark looked at the spreadsheet, then at her. Something in his eyes had softened, though not enough yet to be called a complete change. "Now I am not so sure." The room went silent. The air did not warm immediately. One sentence could not make up for years of being overlooked, but it opened a small crack in the wall Mark had built out of his own confidence. Claire stepped closer and looked at the spreadsheet. "The first week is always the most expensive," she said, "because you are paying with money for the things I used to learn with time." Mark did not answer. He only looked at her, then down at his own hands, the same hands that had once signed the fairness agreement with certainty, the same hands that now knew how to wash a pot, enter receipts, sort laundry incorrectly, and for the first time, understand that life did not become lighter just because he had never held it. Outside the window, Denver sank into night. Inside the apartment, the spreadsheet still glowed on the screen. Not loud, not judgmental, only reflecting. And Mark began to feel afraid, not because Claire was proving him wrong, but because he was beginning to understand that she had been right for a very long time. That fear was not loud. It did not keep him awake in any violent way. It only slipped into every small thing in the apartment, like cold air seeping through a crack in the door. Every time he opened the refrigerator and saw Claire's food containers, arranged neatly inside, he remembered that he had once thought dinner was only about having something to eat. Every time he looked at the spreadsheet, he realized the numbers did not know how to lie. Every time Margaret's name appeared on his phone, he found himself hesitating longer before answering. A week passed, and the apartment was no longer the silent battlefield it had been in those first days, but it had not returned to being home in the old sense either. Claire was still polite, still calm, still living her own life with a kind of self-control that made Mark both respect her and feel strangely unfamiliar with her. She went to the community center to teach, joined online meetings with the team in Boulder, edited lesson materials late into the night, cooked her own meals, recorded her own expenses, and no longer automatically asked what Mark needed. That absence of asking made Mark understand something uncomfortable. Before, he had not only been cared for, he had been anticipated. Claire often knew what he needed before he even noticed it himself. A different shirt when the weather turned cold, a light meal when he had a long meeting, a reminder to call his mother when Margaret's birthday was coming up, a gentle question when he had been silent for too long after work. Now, none of those things fell into his hands on their own anymore. On Saturday afternoon, Mark was standing in front of the kitchen cabinet looking for coffee filters when his phone rang. Sophie Bennett's name lit up on the screen. His sister was calling by video, her voice still quick and bright as always. "Big brother, can we come by Denver next weekend?" Sophie said. "My birthday is coming up. I thought dinner together would be nice." Mark heard the word birthday, and by old reflex, he glanced toward Claire. She was sitting at the dining table, a red pen in her hand, grading her students' work. She did not look up, but Mark knew she had heard. Before, one glance from him would have been enough for Claire to understand. She would open the calendar. Ask what Sophie wanted to eat. Remember that Ethan was vegetarian. Remember that Sophie could not eat nuts. Remember that Margaret liked lemon cake more than chocolate. Remember that Harold often became tired if dinner ran too late. Then she would turn a cheerful phone call into a perfectly prepared dinner. This time, Claire did nothing. Mark turned back to the screen, trying to keep his voice relaxed. "Of course. Next Sunday, then. I will prepare." He said the word "I" a little slower than usual, as if he could hear how different it sounded. Sophie smiled. "Great. Keep it simple. No need to make it fancy." Ethan says hi to Claire. Claire looked up just enough to smile politely when Mark turned the screen toward her. "Hi, Sophie. Happy early birthday." Sophie thanked her, and the call ended. The moment the screen went dark, the apartment fell silent. Mark placed the phone on the table. "Sophie and Ethan are coming for dinner on Sunday," he said. "I think we can do something cozy." Claire set her pen down. "What do you think you will make?" Mark stopped. The question was not loud, but it pulled the entire old habit into the middle of the room. "What do you mean?" Claire looked at him. "Your guests, your sister's birthday, your dinner." Mark breathed in, trying to stay calm. "Sophie is your family too." Claire did not deny it. "Yes, but under the new agreement, each person takes the lead with their own family. I can join as a guest at dinner, but I will not automatically plan the menu, buy the gift, prepare the cake, check everyone's preferences, and clean everything up so you can look like a thoughtful brother." The final sentence struck Mark harder than he wanted. He did not like hearing it because it was true. For too many years he had accepted praise from Sophie and Margaret, while Claire stood behind the kitchen counter, hands still wet, hair slightly messy, her smile gentle but her eyes tired. He said more quietly, "I never meant to take all the credit." Claire answered, "I know, but not meaning to does not make the work disappear any less." Mark had no answer strong enough to give. He stood still, then nodded. "Fine, I will handle it." That night, Mark opened a new note on his phone. The title was Sophie's birthday. He wrote food, cake, drinks, gift, clean the house. Then he stopped. The list looked simple, but behind every line was an empty space. What did Sophie like to eat most in winter? He could not remember. Was Ethan still strictly vegetarian, or did he only avoid red meat? He was not sure. Was Sophie still severely allergic to nuts? He vaguely remembered, but he had never checked on his own. What gift had he given her last year? He looked up at the ceiling, then realized the more accurate question was what Claire had given her under both their names. He wanted to ask Claire, very badly. But every time he turned and saw her focused on reading the contract from Boulder, he swallowed the question. Not because she had forbidden him from asking, but because he understood that if he repeated certain questions too often, his change would become a new burden for her. So he called Margaret. His mother's voice came through after 2 rings, sharp and familiar. "Mom, Sophie, and Ethan are coming for dinner on Sunday. I am preparing. What is Sophie like?" Margaret was quiet for a few seconds, then asked, "Claire is not cooking?" Mark looked toward the living room. Claire was sitting beneath the warm yellow lamp, making notes on a document. He answered this time, "I will handle it myself." Another silence followed. Mark could almost see his mother's expression. Margaret said, "Mark, you are letting this go too far. A family dinner should not become a test." Mark gripped the phone more tightly. Before, that sentence would have made him feel instantly justified. But this time, he remembered the shrunken sweater, the spreadsheet, and the words Harold had not yet said but that Mark could already imagine if his father knew. He answered more slowly, "I do not think it is a test. I think it is something I should know how to do." Margaret was not used to hearing her son speak like that. She exhaled. "Sophie is simple. Buy roasted chicken, salad, cake. Do not make everything so complicated." Mark wanted to believe that. It was easy. It was quick. It made dinner feel like nothing more than buying a few things and placing them on the table. But after a week of living inside the small details, he was beginning to understand that easy things were often only easy because someone else had already thought through the hard part. On Sunday morning, Mark went to the grocery store by himself. He brought a list, but the list still lacked far too much. He chose a roasted chicken that had already gone cold, 2 boxed salads, a long loaf of bread, a bottle of juice, and a chocolate cake covered with walnuts because it looked beautiful, and the employees said it sold very well. He picked up a small bouquet of flowers, then put it back because he was not sure what flowers Sophie liked. Before, Claire always knew. He bought a birthday card and stood in front of the pen display for nearly 5 minutes before writing a few awkward lines. "Happy birthday, Sophie. I hope this year brings you many gentle and happy things. Love, Mark?" He looked at the card. It was not as elegant as the words Claire used to write, but for the first time, it was his handwriting, his thoughts, his responsibility. When he got home, Claire was reading in the living room. She watched him place the grocery bags on the kitchen counter, but she did not immediately stand up to check. Mark took out each item, trying to act natural. Claire looked at the cake. "Did you check the ingredients?" Mark froze. "No. Why? Can Sophie eat nuts?" That question was not a rescue reminder. It came just late enough for Mark to face what he had overlooked. He looked at the layer of walnuts on top of the cake. His face changed almost imperceptibly. "I am not sure." Claire did not tell him he was wrong. She only asked the next question. "And Ethan? What about Ethan? He is vegetarian. Do those two salads have bacon bits in them?" Mark looked down at the label on the box. Yes, clearly, right in front of him. He felt something sink inside his chest. He had gone to the grocery store, he had bought food, he had tried, but he had still prepared like someone who thought dinner was food, not attention. Claire saw the confusion on his face. For one moment, her old instinct pulled her to stand up, grab her keys, say there was still time, fix everything so Sophie would not be disappointed, Ethan would not feel awkward, and Mark would not feel embarrassed. But she stopped herself, not because she wanted anyone to feel uncomfortable, but because if she kept rescuing every outcome, Mark would never learn the cause. She said gently, "You still have time to handle it." Mark looked at the clock. There were more than 2 hours before Sophie arrived. Not much, but not nothing. He immediately picked up his phone and called the bakery nearby to ask about a cake without nuts. They still had a small lemon cake. He ordered it right away. He also ordered a vegetarian dish from a restaurant Claire had used before, but this time he found it himself in his old transaction history instead of asking her. He read the food description carefully, added a note, "No meat, no meat-based broth." He checked it twice. When he put the phone down, he exhaled as if he had just finished a difficult meeting. Claire looked at him. She did not praise him, but her eyes were no longer cold. By nearly 6 o'clock, the apartment was clean enough. Not perfect the way it was when Claire prepared things, but not messy. On the table were roasted chicken, the delivered vegetarian dish, fresh salad without meat, a nut-free lemon cake, and the card Mark had written himself. The chocolate cake covered with nuts was put away separately, not placed on the table. Mark stood in the middle of the kitchen, adjusting the plates one last time. He was still nervous, but he no longer looked like he wanted to prove Claire wrong. He only wanted no one to feel forgotten. The doorbell rang exactly at 6 o'clock. Mark took a deep breath. For the first time before stepping out to open the door, he did not turn to Claire with a look that asked to be rescued. He only said, "I will get it." Claire sat on the sofa and closed her book. She watched him go, and inside her, there was a very small, very cautious feeling. Not trust, not complete relief, but a sign. Mark was no longer pushing the door of family onto her shoulders. He was placing his own hand on it. Mark opened the door just as the bell stopped ringing. In front of him, Sophie stood in her familiar wine-red coat, her blonde hair loosely tied behind her neck, her smile wide as if she had carried a piece of light from the hallway into the apartment. Ethan stood beside her, holding a small gift bag and a bouquet of cream-white flowers. "Happy early birthday," Mark said, his voice slightly rough with tension. Sophie tilted her head and looked at him. He said it in a way that felt unfamiliar. Not with the casual cheer he usually had, when all he needed to do was open his arms to welcome guests and let Claire quietly take care of everything else. This time, he stood at the door like someone who truly understood that the evening was his responsibility. Sophie stepped inside, hugged him, then looked over his shoulder toward the living room. Claire rose from the sofa and smiled gently. "Happy early birthday, Sophie." Sophie came to hug her before even taking off her coat. The hug was more intimate than a greeting, but also more searching than usual. Sophie sensed that something in the apartment had changed. Not the smell of the food, not the way the table was set, but Claire's place in the room. She was not moving back and forth between the kitchen and the dining table, not wiping away some invisible drop of water, not checking the oven, not asking what everyone wanted to drink before she had even sat down herself. She simply stood there, calm, present, without turning herself into the person who served. That made Sophie notice. Ethan stepped in after her, carefully placing the flowers on the side table. "Thanks for having us," he said. "The food smells good." Mark exhaled so softly almost no one heard it. He had checked the vegetarian dish 3 times. He had put the cake with nuts aside. He had placed the nut-free lemon cake in the center of the table. He had used a separate bowl for Ethan's food. Nothing was perfect, but it was no longer careless preparation. Sophie looked at the dining table. Roasted chicken sat on one side. The hot vegetarian dish was in a white porcelain plate. There was salad without meat, a small lemon cake, a card placed beside her seat. There were none of the refined decorations from previous years, none of the exact flowers she liked, none of the cream-colored tablecloth Claire usually used. But one thing made Sophie pause a little longer. The handwritten card, in Mark's handwriting. She picked it up and opened it. She read the few short lines. Her eyes softened for a moment, then immediately became thoughtful. Mark had never written a card like this before. At least Sophie had never received one that felt this awkward and this real. The cards from previous years had been prettier, warmer, more complete, and because of that, she now understood they had probably not come entirely from him. She looked at Claire. "You did not write this, did you?" Claire was quiet for a moment, then answered. "No, Mark wrote it." Sophie turned to her brother. A very slight surprise appeared on her face, not mocking, only realizing. Mark stood beside the table, his hands a little uncertain. For years he had been praised as a thoughtful brother, but tonight, standing in front of a card he had written himself, he felt more exposed than ever. Sophie set the card down. "Is something going on between you two?" The question was not loud, but it changed the rhythm of the air. Mark looked at Claire by instinct, not asking to be rescued the way he used to, only asking with his eyes whether he should tell the truth. Claire did not nod, did not shake her head. She let him choose. This time, if he wanted to grow up, he had to step into the truth with his own feet. Mark pulled out a chair. "Let's sit down first." No one objected. Dinner began with light conversation. Sophie talked about her work at the school library. Ethan talked about a new community garden project. Claire asked a few questions, and Mark joined in too. But beneath the politeness was something unspoken. Sophie could feel it. She had always been more sensitive than Mark thought. She watched how Claire let Mark pour water for the guests himself. Watched how Mark stood up on his own to get extra plates. Watched how Claire did not rush to correct him when he placed a knife slightly crooked. Those details were small, but Sophie understood they were not accidental. When the main course had been served, Sophie set down her fork. "Mark, tell me, what is going on?" Mark sat up straighter. He looked at the card, then at the vegetarian dish in front of Ethan, then at Claire. Shame rose inside him, but this time he did not want to turn it into defense. He said, "I told Claire I wanted everything in our marriage to be clearer. I thought I was caring too much. I said it in a very bad way." Sophie did not take her eyes off him. "How bad?" Mark swallowed. He did not want to repeat the old sentence, not because he was afraid of Sophie's reaction, but because now even he felt how small it sounded. He chose safer, more accurate words, but he did not avoid the truth. "I made Claire feel like what she does has no value. I spoke as if she was not contributing enough." Claire looked down at her glass of water. She did not need him to repeat every old word. What mattered was that he was not denying it. Sophie sat very still. Her expression was not loud anger. It was the kind of slow, deep disappointment that was harder to avoid than any scolding. "Did you really think that?" she asked. Mark looked at his sister. He once would have wanted to answer that he was just stressed, just under pressure, just carried along by his mother's words. But those sentences now sounded like ways to avoid responsibility. He shook his head. "Not now, but at that moment I thought I was right." Sophie exhaled, slow and heavy. "Do you know what the saddest part is? Our whole family got so used to Claire doing too much that when she stopped, everyone would think she had changed. But maybe this is the first time she has actually been allowed to sit still." That sentence passed through the room like a cold wind. Mark did not answer. Ethan looked down at his plate, respecting the family's privacy but not leaving the conversation. Claire looked up, and in her eyes there was something very small, like a wound finally being named correctly by someone else. Sophie continued, her voice calm. "I know more than you think. My birthdays, the gifts for my little girl, the time Dad had knee surgery, holiday dinners, the calls asking what Ethan could eat. Most of it was Claire. I knew because of the way she asked, the way she remembered, the way she noticed things that you only recognized when they were missing." Mark looked at his sister as if she were opening drawer after drawer that he had locked by mistake inside his own mind. Sophie went on. Even your promotion presentation. One time, you accidentally sent the draft to the family group. I saw Claire's notes in it. I saw how she edited each section. When you were praised, I was happy for you too. But I remember thinking, I hope he knows to thank the person who helped him become sharper. Mark felt his face grow hot, not because a secret had been exposed, but because the secret had never truly been a secret. Other people had seen it, only he had chosen not to. Claire said nothing. Her silence no longer needed to defend itself. Sophie was saying the things Claire had grown too tired to repeat. Mark placed both hands on the table. I did not know you saw those things. Sophie looked at him directly. Mark, the problem is not whether I saw them. The problem is that you had to see them. The air went still. Dinner was still on the table. The vegetarian dish was still warm. The lemon cake had not yet been cut. There was no grand scene, no heavy language, only a family touching the truth with words kind enough not to break anyone, but clear enough that no one could hide. Only then did Ethan speak. Mark, I do not think anyone here wants to blame you just to make you feel worse, but sometimes we need to hear the truth from someone else, especially when the person closest to us has been saying it for too long and we have not been listening. Mark looked at Ethan. The words were gentle, but they gave him no escape. He nodded slowly. I understand. Sophie looked at Claire, her voice softening. Are you okay? Claire breathed in. The question was simple, but for a long time, very few people had asked it as if her answer truly mattered. I am learning how to be okay without disappearing, she said. Sophie placed her hand over Claire's for a few seconds. Not long, not turning the moment into a tragedy. Just a recognition. You deserve that. Mark heard those words, and this time he did not feel excluded. He felt that he should have been the one to say them a long time ago. After dinner, Sophie did not leave early as if after an argument. She stayed, ate the lemon cake, and thanked Mark for remembering to change the food properly. But when she said it, she looked at him very clearly so he would understand that this gratitude was not a reward for doing the minimum. It was the recognition of a first step. Before leaving, Sophie hugged Claire. Do not go back to doing everything alone just because other people are starting to find it hard, she said quietly. Claire closed her eyes for a beat. I will try to remember. Sophie turned to Mark. And you need to remember too, if you want to keep what is good in your life, do not only love it when it serves you. Take care of it when it needs to be seen. Mark nodded. He did not say much. This time, there were fewer words than feelings. When the door closed, the apartment became quiet. But this silence was different from the night before. It was no longer just the emptiness after disappointment. It was the silence after a piece of truth had been spoken and no one had avoided it. Claire began gathering her own glass. Mark stood up immediately. Let me clean up the table. Claire looked at him, not to prove something, Mark. He nodded. I know, because this is my part. She did not answer, but she did not stop him. Mark carried the plates into the kitchen and turned on the faucet. As the water began to run, he looked at the table where Sophie's card still lay. His awkward lines could not make up for years of Claire writing on his behalf, but at least tonight, for the first time, he had written them himself. And when Claire walked into her office, she knew what had not yet been placed on the table was still there, the green folder, the larger truth. Not to make Mark feel ashamed, but to let him see the whole picture before it was too late. That night, after Sophie and Ethan left, Claire sat alone at her desk for a very long time. The office door was only half closed. From outside came the sound of running water, the soft clink of dishes, the sound of Mark clearing the dining table without waiting for her to remind him. Those sounds should have made her feel lighter. And part of her did feel lighter, but something deeper inside her still knew that change through small actions was only the beginning. If Mark wanted to understand the whole truth, he could not only look at the last few days, he had to look at the years before them. Claire opened the drawer. The green folder lay beneath a few stacks of teaching materials. It was not thick enough to draw attention, but to Claire, it felt as heavy as a room full of things left unsaid. She had not created it in one night. It had been formed from all the times she wondered whether she was being too sensitive. From the mornings when she paid the bills, then went back to making breakfast as if nothing had happened. From the nights when she edited documents for Mark, sent the file back, then watched him receive praise with a confident smile at dinner the next evening. At first, she kept those things only to remind herself that what she did was real. Then, every receipt, every email, every note about time became a small piece of a picture Mark had never stood far enough away to see. She carried the folder out. Mark was wiping the table. He moved slowly, more carefully than before, as if missing one drop of water would also mean missing a lesson. When he saw Claire, he stopped. His eyes fell to the folder, then returned to her face. "Claire," he said softly, "what is that?" She placed the folder on the dining table, the same table where he had once said he wanted everything to be clearer, the same table where the awkward card for Sophie still sat in one corner, the same table that had watched the soup grow cold on the first night everything changed. Claire sat down. "This is the rest of the clarity." Mark pulled out a chair and sat across from her. This time, he did not immediately become defensive. After the conversation with Sophie, he had learned that there were moments when rushing to explain would only mean covering his ears again. Claire opened the first page. "This part is my income," she said. Mark looked down. On the page was a summary of her part-time teaching salary at the community center, her curriculum editing contracts, payments from online courses, and the confirmation email from Boulder about the new content consulting project. None of the numbers were displayed as a boast. They were simply placed there, direct and quiet. Mark read slowly. His face changed little by little. "I did not know your work had grown this much." Claire looked at him. "You never asked long enough to know." The sentence was not sharp, but it made Mark lower his eyes. He remembered the times Claire said she had a draft to revise. He would usually answer with something general, "That is good," then go back to talking about his own meeting. He remembered the evenings when she sat at her computer after she had already cleaned the kitchen, while he thought she was only handling a few random tasks. Now the lines on the paper showed that another career had been growing in the shadow of being overlooked. Claire turned to the next section. "These are household costs during the periods when you changed jobs, when bonuses were delayed, or when the company had not reimbursed your travel expenses yet." Mark looked at the notes. 1 month of rent where she had paid more, an internet bill she handled when the joint account was short, a heater repair she paid in advance and never brought up again. None of the lines were written in an accusing voice, but their calmness gave them weight. He remembered some of it, but not enough. Claire said, "I am not showing you these things to say you never contributed. You did contribute. You worked hard, I know that, but you used your contribution to conclude that mine was smaller while you had never looked at enough of the data." Mark nodded very slowly. The statement was so fair that he could not avoid it. Claire turned the page again. "This part is the Bennett family." Mark saw his mother's name, his father's name, Sophie's name, Sophie's daughter's name. Beside them were gifts, shipping costs, appointments, meals, visits, flowers, cards, small expenses added up across the years. He touched one line marked with Margaret's birthday. That year, his mother had called him a thoughtful son. He still remembered the pride he felt when she said it. Now he saw the receipt for the silk scarf under Claire's name. The birthday card note was also in Claire's handwriting. He exhaled very softly. "I accepted thanks for too many things I did not do alone." Claire did not answer. She did not need to. The truth had already spoken for itself. Then she took out a thinner stack of papers clipped separately. "This is the work of yours that I helped with." Mark went still. This was the part he feared most, even before he knew why. On the table were printouts of the emails he had sent Claire with subject lines asking her to take a look, drafts of presentations, sections she had revised, notes in the margins, opening lines rewritten, data sections rearranged for clarity. He recognized the presentation that had helped him get promoted. It lay there now, no longer a bright memory that belonged only to him, but a product with someone else's fingerprints everywhere. Claire said, "I am not trying to take credit away from you. You worked, you presented, you carried pressure. But I want you to understand that your success did not happen in an empty space. Someone stood behind you, not to replace you, but so you could step forward at your best." Mark looked at Claire's notes. He remembered that night. He had been tired, irritated, saying the file was too messy and he had no mind left to fix it. Claire had said, "Let me take a look." The next morning, the presentation was cleaner, sharper, brighter. He had said a quick thank you, then carried it away as if it had naturally become part of him. He placed his hand on the page. "I am sorry I did not see it." Claire looked at him for a long time. Not seeing once is an oversight. Not seeing for years is a choice repeated. Mark did not argue. The sentence hurt, but it was not unfair. Finally, Claire opened the last section. "There are no receipts here," she said, "only time." On the page were estimated lines: cooking, cleaning, grocery shopping, laundry, managing the family calendar, reminding him of work schedules, preparing gifts, making check-in calls, softening tense conversations, rearranging her own day so someone else's day could breathe more easily. Each item had hours listed by week, by month, by year, written out in words, not exaggerated, not dramatized. But when added together, they made Mark sit in silence as if he had just heard a truth he could not turn away from. He had once thought Claire had more time because her work was flexible. Now he understood that her flexibility had been used like a bag where every task no one else wanted to hold had been placed. Claire said, "This is what I wanted you to see. Not so you would feel terrible, not so I could win, but so that from now on, if you say fairness, you understand that fairness does not only live inside an account." Mark looked at the folder, then at Claire. There was no longer any desire to argue in his eyes, only shame settling downward, and beneath it, a new awareness beginning to form. He said, "I thought I was the one building this life." Claire answered, "You did build, but I built too. I just built the parts you never named." The room went quiet. Outside the window, the city of Denver glowed beneath the night sky. Inside, Mark looked at the woman in front of him as if he were seeing her for the first time, not only as his wife, not only as the person who lived in the same house, not only as the person who had once made everything easier. She was a person with ability, with achievements, with memory, with limits, and with the right to be fully seen. Claire closed the folder. "Tonight, I do not need you to promise anything grand," she said. "I only need you not to forget what it felt like to see the whole picture." Mark nodded. This time, he did not rush to say he would fix everything immediately. He did not try to pull the conversation toward forgiveness. He only sat there, with the folder between them, letting the truth remain long enough. After a while, Claire stood and walked back toward her office. Before going in, she turned around. "Your father may call. Sophie is not someone who stays silent when she sees something important." Mark looked at the phone on the table. The screen was dark, but he had the feeling that the call was already very close. Claire continued, "If he calls, you should listen to understand, not to defend yourself." The office door closed, but not completely. Mark sat alone. In front of him were the green folder, the spreadsheet, and the clean dining table. For the first time, the room no longer made him feel judged. It made him feel as if he had been given a rare chance, a chance to see clearly before it was too late. And this time, he knew that if he wanted to keep what was good in his life, he could not only say he understood. He had to live like someone who truly did. No one in the room said that sentence out loud, but Mark heard it more clearly than any sound. The green folder still lay on the dining table, silent and orderly, as if it had not just opened an entire part of life he had ignored. Claire had returned to her office. The door was left half-closed, letting a thin strip of light fall across the wooden floor. That strip of light was not an invitation. It was a boundary, clear, kind, but no longer easy to cross. Mark sat alone for a very long time. He did not open the folder again. He did not have enough courage yet to read every page once more, but everything he had already seen kept appearing in his mind. The money Claire had quietly paid, the gifts that carried both their names but had been chosen by her. The emails he had sent in a rush late at night, asking her to look over his presentation. Her notes, sharp, patient, precise, woven into the success he had once believed belonged almost entirely to him. He had once believed he was the one pulling the marriage forward. Now he realized that maybe Claire had been walking beside him all along, only he had always moved too fast to look over. The phone on the table vibrated. Mark looked at the screen. Harold Bennett. His father's name appeared plainly, nothing unusual about it, yet it made Mark's palms turn cold. Harold was not the kind of man who called to say things that did not need to be said. He was a man of few words, someone who had worked in maintenance for many years, more used to fixing broken things with his hands than talking about feelings. In the Bennett family, if Margaret was the one who spoke often, directed often, interfered often, Harold usually stood back, watched, stayed quiet, and only spoke when something truly mattered. Mark let the phone ring one more time. Then he answered. Dad. The other end was quiet for a few seconds. Mark heard the old clock in his parents' house, the faint static of the line, then Harold's voice came through, deep and slow. Sophie told me about dinner. Mark closed his eyes. He knew. Harold did not rush to continue. His silence always carried its own weight. It did not pressure people with volume, it forced them to face what they had done. I'm not calling to scold you so I can feel better, Harold said. I am calling because I want to know whether you truly understand what is happening. Mark looked down at his own hands. His fingers were still slightly dry from dish soap. A week ago, that might have annoyed him. Tonight, it made him feel smaller, more real. I am beginning to understand, he answered. Beginning is good, Harold said, but beginning is not the same as understanding. Mark did not reply. The sentence was too close to what Claire had just reminded him. Realizing was not the destination. Apologizing was not repair. One right action could not erase a wrong habit if tomorrow a person simply returned to the way things used to be. Harold asked, Do you remember when I had knee surgery? Mark lifted his head slightly. Yes. Do you remember who called the hospital to ask about the medication schedule after I came home? Mark was silent. Do you remember who arranged a ride for your mother to my follow-up appointment because you were away on a business trip? He tightened his grip on the phone. Do you remember who sent soft food for me during the first week? Mark no longer needed to answer. He knew the answer before Harold said it. It was Claire, Harold said, not you. The sentence was not spoken to shame Mark. That was exactly why it felt heavier. Harold did not use the truth as a weapon. He placed it down like a necessary tool on a repair table, so his son would finally have to look at what was broken. Mark remembered that time. He remembered the hospital, remembered texting Claire that he could not make it back in time, remembered her reply, I will handle it. Back then, those 3 words had relieved him. Now those 3 words made his throat tighten. He had accepted that relief, then never asked how tired it had made her. Harold continued, his voice still even. Your mother's birthday last year, Claire chose the silk scarf. Claire wrote the card. I know because your handwriting has never been that soft. Thanksgiving the year before, the one who called Sophie to ask what Ethan could eat was Claire too. Those things are not huge if you look at each one alone, but when you add them up, they are a whole part of the family she kept from falling. Mark looked toward the office door. The strip of light was still there. He wondered whether Claire could hear. Part of him hoped she could. Another part of him felt too ashamed to think about it. I did not mean to overlook her, Mark said, his voice low. Harold exhaled. Not meaning to is what people say when they begin to recognize the consequences, but you have to understand, not meaning to does not automatically make someone else less tired. That sentence went straight through Mark. It was not harsh, it was not judgmental, but it gave him nowhere to hide. Harold slowly continued. When I was younger, I also thought I was the one carrying the family because I worked full-time and brought home a steady paycheck. I thought the things your mother did were just the normal rhythm of a household. Until one time she was sick for almost a week. I did not know where your medicine was. I did not know which bill was due. I did not know what you liked to eat when you had a fever. I did not know who needed to be called before a Memorial Day. That was when I understood that some work is only invisible when someone does it too well. Mark had never heard his father speak about that before. Harold had always been calm, steady, rarely bringing up old mistakes. Hearing him admit he had once been wrong left Mark with no defense to hold on to. If his father, the man he had always seen as strong and honorable, had also needed to learn again, then maybe admitting the truth did not make Mark smaller. Maybe it only made him more honest. Harold said, "I was lucky your mother gave me the chance to learn. But chances are not things that naturally stay forever. If someone waits too long to be seen, one day they will learn how to live without the person who never saw them." Mark felt his chest tighten. "I do not want to lose Claire," he said. "Then do not only try to keep her," Harold replied. "Learn how to be worthy of her presence." Mark lowered his head. The sentence was gentler than a warning, but deeper. Keeping someone could come from fear. Being worthy of someone had to come from change. A long silence passed. Then Harold said, "There is one more thing. You need to talk to your mother yourself." Mark closed his eyes. Margaret. Harold understood that silence. "I know your mother has influenced how you see this. She is not a bad person, but there are things she believes because she was once hurt, not because they are true. You cannot take your mother's fear and place it on Claire's shoulders." Mark remembered the call the morning after the first night, remembered his mother's voice talking about order, clarity, value, control. Those words had once made him feel strong. Now they were beginning to reveal their sharp edges. Not every piece of advice from family was truth. Some words were only wounds passed on in the tone of experience. "I will talk to Mom," Mark said. "Not to blame her," Harold reminded him, "to set boundaries. A grown man does not need to choose between his wife and his mother, but he does need to know how not to let one hurt the other." Mark lifted his head. This was what he had avoided for years. He let Claire be gentle with Margaret because it was easier. He let his mother make half-joking, half-serious comments because objecting would make the room uncomfortable. He had called that keeping the peace, but now he understood that peace had been bought with Claire's silence. Harold said his final words slowly and clearly. "Son, success outside the home does not mean much if, when you come home, you do not know how to respect the person who helped you build that life." The call ended after a few brief words. No drama, no noise. But when the screen went dark, Mark felt as if he had just stepped out of an old room where he had once hung all his reasons to defend himself. He sat still for a while longer. Then the office door opened. Claire stepped out. She did not ask who had called. She did not ask what Harold had said. Her eyes only rested on his face long enough for Mark to understand that if he wanted to speak, she would listen. If he did not, she would not pull the words out of him. Mark stood up. "Dad said a lot of things that were right," he said. Claire stayed silent. He breathed in. This time, he did not try to choose a beautiful sentence. He did not use a persuasive voice. He did not turn his regret into a speech. He said, "I confused earning more money with contributing more. I let you hold too many parts of this life, then acted as if they carried no weight. And I let my mother influence the way I looked at you, instead of looking with my own eyes." Claire looked at him. There was exhaustion in her eyes, but it was no longer only exhaustion. There was a little quietness finding its way back, very slowly, very cautiously. She said, "Hearing that does not make everything heal on its own." "I know. And if you only understand tonight, then go back to the old way tomorrow, all of these words will mean nothing. I know that too." Mark did not say it quickly. He did not sound like someone trying to end the conversation as soon as possible. He sounded like someone finally accepting that repair was not one emotional moment, but a series of very ordinary days in which he had to choose correctly even when no one was watching. Claire walked to the table and placed her hand on the green folder. "Then start with specific things." Mark nodded. "I will call Sophie tomorrow to thank her and apologize clearly. I will manage my side of the family calendar myself. I will talk to Mom, but I will not let it become an argument. And starting this week, I will prepare my own work materials before asking anyone for feedback." Claire looked at him longer. "Feedback is not wrong," she said, "but I do not want to keep being the person who fixes everything at the last minute, so you can walk out as if it was all ready because of you." Mark felt the sentence hurt, but he did not avoid it. "I understand." Outside, Denver sank into the lights of the night. The apartment still held tensions that had not fully dissolved, but the air was different, not completely gentle, only more honest. Mark walked into the kitchen, opened the spreadsheet, and added a new section himself: responsibilities to track. He typed slowly: Bennett family calendar, personal work preparation, calls to parents, cleaning up after meals, checking shared household supplies. Claire stood a few steps away, watching him. She did not smile, but this time she did not turn away either. In that moment, Mark understood that a chance was not a door thrown wide open. It was only a very thin strip of light, and if he wanted to keep that strip of light, he would have to walk toward it every day. Mark understood that the very next morning, when the alarm rang before the sun had time to lay its light across the rooftops of Denver. This time, he did not stay in bed. He did not wait for a gentle voice from outside the door. He did not let himself drift back into an old habit. He turned off the alarm, sat up, and in the first few seconds of the new day, the silence around him no longer felt like abandonment. It felt like an empty space where he could stand up on his own. He went into the kitchen quietly. The coffee machine was still in the same place. The coffee beans were still on the top shelf. Nothing had changed, only the person using them had to change. Mark reread the small instructions he had written for himself on a sticky note. 2 spoons of coffee, just enough water, do not press the button hard twice. The first cup of coffee was still a little bitter, but it was no longer as difficult to drink as before. He did not make coffee for Claire. He simply boiled a kettle of water and placed a small note beside it. Hot water is ready if you want to make tea. When Claire came out, she looked at that note longer than she looked at the water. Such a small thing, but that small thing was different from Mark's past actions. He was not doing something for her. He was not deciding what she wanted. He was not turning care into a form of control. He was only opening a possibility and letting her choose. Claire did not say thank you right away. She poured the water, made her tea, then sat down at the table. After a while, she said softly, "This is better." Mark nodded. A short sentence like that was enough for him to begin the day without rushing to demand more recognition. The next 30 days did not look like a beautiful healing scene from a movie. They were messy, sometimes clumsy, sometimes silent, sometimes exhausting for both of them. Mark began with specific things. He scheduled trash night for Tuesday evening. He checked the electricity bill himself. He bought shared household items after reviewing the list. He read the detergent label before putting clothes into the machine. He learned how to separate light colors, dark colors, wool, and towels. For the first time, he understood that the laundry basket was not an object that magically appeared in the corner and disappeared by itself a few hours later. But learning did not happen in a straight line. Some days, he forgot to take clothes out of the washing machine, leaving the whole load smelling damp. Some days, he bought too many vegetables because he thought buying more meant being thoughtful, then had to sit down and plan meals again so nothing would go to waste. Some days he wiped the kitchen counter with the wrong cloth and left a cloudy streak across the stone. Those mistakes were not serious, but they forced him to face a truth Claire had known for a long time. Family life was not difficult because each task was too big. It was difficult because it never stopped. Before, Mark could finish a major project at work and receive praise in a meeting. At home, there was no weekly review for not running out of toilet paper, not burning a pot, not forgetting a bill, not making anyone in the family feel forgotten. When household work was done well, it usually created only one thing: peace. And peace, when no one noticed it, was very easy to mistake for something natural. One Thursday evening, Mark called Sophie. He had written down a few points in advance, not so he could read them like a prepared apology, but so he would not avoid the important parts. He said he had not known enough about his own sister. He had allowed Claire to stand between him and the details of his family. He thanked Sophie for speaking honestly without making things more hurtful than necessary. Sophie was silent for a while, then answered, "I do not need you to become perfect in 1 month, but I do need you to stop calling the things Claire used to do small." Mark looked down at the table. He said, "I understand." Sophie's voice softened. "Then keep understanding next week, and the week after that." That sentence followed Mark through the night. Keep understanding, not understand once, not understand in one emotional moment. Understanding was something that had to be repeated. At work, Mark also began to see things he had once overlooked. In a strategy meeting, a colleague named Dana presented a plan to improve winter delivery routes. She spoke clearly, used solid data, and offered a practical proposal. But right after that, another manager repeated the core idea in a more confident voice, and the room began turning toward him. Before, Mark might have simply nodded along with the current. But this time, he saw Claire and Dana's silence. He saw notes being ignored. He saw effort changing ownership just because the person who spoke later had a louder voice. He set his pen down. "I want to go back to what Dana just presented," Mark said. "The original idea is hers, and the part about predicting the bottleneck is the most important piece. We should evaluate that contribution properly." The room went quiet for one beat. Dana looked at him, slightly surprised. The other manager said nothing more. Mark did not feel as though he had done something grand. He only felt that for the first time, he had not allowed another person to disappear right in front of him. That night, he told Claire about it, not as a boast, not in the tone of, "Do you see that I have changed?" He only told her because the moment had made him think of her. Claire listened, then set down her cup of tea. "Did it bother you to witness that?" Mark nodded. "Because it looked like something you once did to me?" The question was direct but not cruel. Mark answered, "Yes, and I did not like seeing myself in it." Claire looked at him for a long time. Then she said, "Then keep seeing it next time." There was no grand praise, no rushed forgiveness. But to Mark, that sentence mattered more. It did not close the story. It asked him to continue. On the 20th day, Mark prepared an evening call with Harold and Margaret by himself. With Harold, he asked about the follow-up appointment, medication, and the repair of the backyard fence. With Margaret, he calmly said that from now on, he wanted to manage the Bennett family matters himself. He also made it clear that Claire was not responsible for making him appear more thoughtful in the eyes of the whole family. Margaret was silent for quite a while. She was not pleased immediately. She did not react harshly either. She only said, "I need time to get used to this." Mark replied, "So do I, but I am learning." That was the first time he did not use his mother as a place to confirm that he was right. He spoke to her like an adult, without resisting, without blaming, but also without avoiding. By the 30th day, Mark cooked dinner. A pasta dish with vegetables, mushrooms, and tomato sauce. He had adjusted several times. The meal was not perfect. The sauce was a little thick. The vegetables were a little soft. The table was not arranged as beautifully as Claire used to do it. But everything was clean, warm, and prepared with real attention. He did not call Claire over as if inviting her to witness an achievement. He only placed the plate down and said, "Tonight is my turn to cook. If you want to eat, there is a portion for you. If the taste is not right, I will adjust it next time." Claire looked at the plate of food, then at him. "You are not going to ask me whether I think you did well?" Mark exhaled, almost smiling. "I want to ask, but I think it is better if I just keep doing it until this no longer needs praise to have meaning." Claire sat down. A very light silence passed between them. It was no longer sharp like the first days, no longer full of defense. It felt like the silence of two people standing on a newly built bridge, not trusting it enough to run across, but finding it strong enough for the first step. After dinner, Mark cleared the table himself. Claire stayed seated, watching him wash the dishes, wipe the stove, and put away the leftover food. His movements were not perfect, but they no longer carried the air of performance. They were things that needed to be done, and he did them. When he returned to the table, Claire asked, "After 30 days, what do you understand?" Mark did not answer immediately. He looked at the kitchen, then at the spreadsheet, then at the green folder on the shelf, then at the woman in front of him. "I understand that you did not do everything because it was easy. You did it because if you did not, someone still had to do it, and I let that someone be you for far too long." Claire lowered her eyes. That sentence did not erase the old wound, but it touched the place where the truth needed to be touched. Mark continued, "I do not want you to have to prove your value to me anymore. Not with a spreadsheet, not with a folder, not by stopping everything. I want to learn how to see before you have to stop." Claire did not smile widely, but her eyes softened. Outside the window, Denver glowed beneath the night. Inside the apartment, there were no loud promises, no dazzling climax. Only a man learning how to care back, and a woman cautiously allowing herself to believe that maybe, only maybe, this change was not a moment. It was a direction. Claire did not know exactly where that direction would lead them. She only knew that after 30 days of Mark learning how to stand inside his own life, the apartment felt less cold. Not immediately warm. Not the easy kind of warmth found in stories repaired by one apology and one dinner. It was a slow warmth, like winter sunlight slipping through the curtains, faint but real. Mark was still clumsy. Some days he forgot to hang the kitchen towel out to dry. Some days he bought the wrong tea, the kind Claire usually did not drink. Some days he stood in front of the refrigerator for a long time, trying to remember which food needed to be used before it expired. But the difference was that he no longer did those things like a man performing change. He did them like someone who understood that this home was also his responsibility. Claire saw that, but she also saw something else that had not yet been touched. Margaret. The name sat between them like an empty chair in the room. No one sat on it, but everyone could see it there. Mark's mother had not been physically present on the night everything changed, but her voice had been inside the way Mark looked at Claire. In the words about order, fairness, value, success, in the way he had once believed that a paycheck could define the full contribution of a person. Mark had spoken with Margaret on the phone a few times after that. He was calmer, less defensive, but Claire knew that one phone call could not undo beliefs that had been nourished for years. Some beliefs did not leave just because someone said they understood. They needed to be faced under real light. On Sunday afternoon, while Claire was reading a new draft from the Boulder team, the doorbell rang. Mark was folding clothes in the living room. He looked up at her, not with the old look that assumed she would go open the door. This time, it was a silent question, one that respected her space. He stood. "I will get it." Claire set the draft down. She did not know who was there, but deep inside she had already guessed before Mark even touched the doorknob. Margaret Bennett stood in the hallway. She was not wearing her usual elegant coat. There was no silk scarf tied perfectly around her neck, none of the sharp confidence she carried each time she stepped into her son's home and instantly made everyone adjust their posture. Today, Margaret wore a pale gray sweater, one hand gripping the strap of her handbag. Her face was not weak, but tired, the kind of tiredness that belonged to someone who had been forced to look at herself and did not like everything she saw. Mark stood still for one beat. "Mom, why didn't you call first?" Margaret looked at her son, then passed his shoulder toward Claire. "I was afraid that if I called first, I would find a reason not to come." That sentence made the air inside the apartment slow down. Claire stood. She did not hurry forward to greet her the way she used to. Before, whenever Margaret came over, Claire would immediately ask whether she wanted tea or coffee, check the cake in the oven, adjust the pillow on the sofa, do everything to make the older woman feel welcomed. Today, she simply stood upright, her hands resting lightly at her sides. "Hello, Mom." Her voice was polite, calm, but she was no longer erasing herself. Margaret heard it. She stepped inside more slowly than usual. Her eyes moved across the living room, the wooden table, the basket of clothes Mark had not finished folding, the family tracker still resting in the corner of the table. Perhaps she understood at once that this home had changed not because of the objects in it, but because the woman who had once quietly served inside it had taken back her place. Mark invited his mother to sit. He did not call Claire to prepare water. He went into the kitchen himself, poured a glass, and placed it in front of Margaret. The gesture was small, but Margaret saw it. Claire saw it too. Margaret sat down, both hands around the glass without drinking. "I spoke with Sophie," Margaret began, "and then with your father." Mark sat down beside Claire, not too close, but clearly enough that he was not standing between his mother and his wife to shield the truth. He stood on the same side as responsibility. Margaret looked at Claire. "I was wrong." Those 3 words were not loud, but to Mark they almost did not feel real. His mother was not someone who easily admitted mistakes. All her life, she had lived through certainty. She could argue about how to cook a dish, how to spend money, how to raise a child, how to hold a family together. That certainty had helped her survive many difficulties, but it had also made it hard for her to listen when someone else was hurt. Claire did not answer right away. She looked at Margaret, waiting to see whether the apology could stand after the first sentence. Margaret lowered her eyes to the glass of water. I said unfair things about you to Mark. I made him think that if a person did not earn more money, it meant that person contributed less. I dismissed the things you did because I had once been taught that those things were a woman's duty in a family. She stopped, as if the next sentence was harder. But duty should not become another name for being overlooked. Claire felt something move gently inside her chest. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the recognition that Margaret had not come here just to say one sentence and be done. She spoke slowly. What hurt me was not only that you had opinions about me. What hurt me was that you received my care, then taught Mark to see that care as something that did not matter. Margaret closed her eyes for a beat. When she opened them, her voice was lower. I know, and I am sorry for that. Mark looked at his mother. She was no longer the powerful voice on the phone, no longer the person who always made him feel right. She was only an older woman facing the consequences of beliefs she had once passed down. For the first time, Mark understood that loving his mother did not mean continuing everything she had taught him. Sometimes loving your mother meant being grown enough to say, "This needs to stop with me." He spoke. Mom, I need to be clear too. From now on, if you have worries about my life, you can talk to me. But you cannot speak about Claire as if she is the reason I become weaker. Claire does not make me weak. She helped make me stronger for many years. I just did not see it the right way. Margaret looked at her son. A small sadness passed through her eyes. Not sadness because he had opposed her, but because she realized her son had finally stepped out of her shadow in a calm and kind way. She nodded. I understand. Claire looked at Mark. His words did not erase the past, but they placed a new stone into the foundation of the future. Before, he had often left her to soften herself around Margaret in order to keep the peace. Today, he did not leave her standing alone. Margaret turned back to Claire. I do not expect you to forget right away. I also do not expect everything to go back to the way it was after one afternoon. Claire answered. I do not want everything to go back to the way it was either. That sentence made the whole room fall silent. Claire continued. The way it was meant that I did too much, stayed silent too much, then convinced myself that as long as the family was peaceful, it was enough. I do not want that kind of peace anymore. Margaret nodded slowly. Then from now on, I will learn how to respect your boundaries. Claire looked at her. Boundaries are not only about not saying hurtful things. Boundaries also mean not assuming I will stand up to serve, not assuming I will remember things for everyone, not assuming my gentleness is something that can be used forever without being returned. Margaret tightened her hand slightly around the glass. I will remember. No one hugged. There was no grand reconciliation, no swelling music, no tears being used to shorten the road of repair. There were only 3 people sitting in one room, finally speaking honestly to each other, in voices calm enough that the truth did not turn into a contest of winning and losing. When Margaret stood to leave, she paused at the door. Claire, thank you for hearing me. Claire answered, I heard you because you spoke honestly. The rest will need time. Margaret nodded. This time she did not try to say more just to make herself feel lighter. She stepped into the hallway and Mark walked her to the elevator. Before the elevator doors closed, Margaret looked at her son. Do not change only because you are afraid of losing her, she said softly. Change because it is the right way to love someone. Mark stood still for a long time after his mother left. When he returned to the apartment, Claire was standing by the window. The afternoon light rested on her face, softening the tired lines there. Mom has never apologized like that, Mark said. Claire looked at the city outside. Then maybe you were not the only one who learned something today? Mark stepped closer, but he did not touch her without knowing whether she wanted him to. He asked, What do you want me to do now? Claire turned to look at him. That question had once exhausted her because it placed another responsibility to guide him on her shoulders. But today, Mark's voice was different. He was not asking so he could escape thinking. He was asking so he would not decide for her. She looked around the living room. The basket of clothes was still only half folded. Keep folding, she said. Put the white shirts aside and do not press too hard on the collars. Mark looked in the direction she pointed, then gave a very quiet laugh. Okay. He returned to the basket. Claire went back to her chair and reopened the draft. The sound of fabric being folded, pages turning, and the distant city beyond the window blended together. Nothing grand happened after that. But sometimes a family does not begin to heal in big declarations. Sometimes it begins in the moment when each person finally agrees to hold the work, the mistakes, and the love that belong to them. 6 months later, the small apartment in Denver no longer felt like the place that had once held too much silence. Not because everything had become perfect, not because Mark had suddenly become a husband who never made mistakes, and not because Claire had forgotten the words that had hurt her. Old scratches did not disappear simply because time had passed. They only stopped bleeding when people stopped touching them with the same carelessness. The change lived in the mornings. Before, every day began with Claire's quiet footsteps. She was the one who made coffee, checked the refrigerator, folded shirts, placed the keys where they belonged, reminded him of meetings, prepared lunch, then forced herself to believe that this was a normal way to love. Now there were two people moving through the kitchen. Not always smoothly. Some days, Mark dropped a spoon on the floor. Some days, Claire forgot to buy the tea she liked. Some days they were both tired and ordered something simple, but neither of them assumed the other person had to rescue their entire day anymore. Mark knew how to make his own coffee. He knew how to boil hot water for Claire without deciding for her. He knew which milk to buy, but still asked if she changed her habits. He knew the day Sophie was organizing her daughter's birthday. He knew Harold had a follow-up appointment on the first Thursday of the month. He knew Margaret liked cream-colored flowers, but he no longer let Claire order them and sign both their names. Those things were small, but in a marriage, small things repeated long enough become the climate. Claire lived in that new climate carefully. She did not rush into trust just because Mark had tried for a few months. She did not blame herself for still being cautious. She understood that trust was not a door thrown open after one apology. It was like a small path, one that had to be walked many times without being abandoned halfway. Mark understood that too. He no longer asked, "Have you forgiven me yet?" Every time he did one thing right. He did not use his change like a ticket to demand the old tenderness back. He did what needed to be done, then let time answer for itself. There were evenings when he cleaned the kitchen while Claire read a draft. There were Sundays when the two of them sat together and reviewed the family tracker. The spreadsheet was still there, but it was no longer evidence of a fight. It had become a map of balance. They did not only record rent, utilities, and groceries, they recorded time. Who was overloaded, who needed rest, who had to travel for work, who had a deadline, who needed an evening without being asked one more thing. For the first time, emotions also had a seat in the conversation about responsibility. And Claire, the woman who had once been underestimated inside her own home, also began stepping more clearly into her own world. The Boulder Project did not stop at a short-term contract. Her curriculum was expanded into a training program for multiple community centers across the state. Claire Bennett's name appeared on official materials as the lead content consultant. Students she had once taught sent emails thanking her. An education organization invited her to speak at a small seminar about adult learning. When the invitation arrived, Claire looked at it for a long time. Not because she doubted that she deserved it, but because for a long time she had been used to doing important things in the dark. Mark read the letter after she handed it to him. He did not say, "That is great," in the old casual way. He asked, "What kind of support do you want from me so you have time to prepare?" Claire looked at him. The question was simple, but it touched her more deeply than praise. Because this time, her success was not being placed at the edge of their shared life. It was brought into the center, where every plan had to move around both of them. A few weeks later, Mark also received an envelope from his company, a new promotion offer, a higher position, better pay, more authority, but also more long-distance travel and a main office in Salt Lake City. 6 months earlier, Mark probably would have come home with bright eyes and said this was an opportunity he could not miss. He would have said everything would be fine. He would have believed Claire could adjust, because she had always adjusted. But that night, he walked into her office, placed the envelope on the table, and sat down. I have not answered yet, he said. I want us to look at how this affects both of us. Claire looked up from her draft. For one very brief moment, she saw the shadow of the old man and the present man standing beside each other. The old one would have decided first and announced it later. The present one stopped at the threshold of her life. She asked, "Do you want to accept it?" Mark looked at the envelope. Part of him wanted to. That was the truth. He still had ambition. He still liked his work. Change did not turn him into someone without dreams. It only taught him that one person's dream was not allowed to swallow the other person's life. He said, "I want to consider it, but I do not want success if the cost is that you have to turn yourself into empty space again." Claire was quiet for a while. The sentence was not perfect, but it was true. And after everything, truth was always worth more than beautiful promises. They sat together for nearly 2 hours. They calculated travel time. They calculated the days Claire needed to go to Boulder. They considered hiring help for cleaning twice a month. They planned time to call Harold and Margaret. They reviewed the budget. They considered both of their mental health. No one tried to win. No one had to become smaller. No one used the word fairness as an excuse to take the more convenient part for themselves. In the end, Mark decided he would negotiate flexible work conditions. If the company accepted limits on travel days and allowed him to keep a stable family schedule, he would consider it. If not, he would turn it down. Claire asked, "Will you regret it?" Mark looked at her, then at the envelope. "I would regret having another new title more if it meant losing the way I have learned to see you." That sentence made the room fall silent. Not silent because of pain. Silent because something had finally been placed where it belonged. That night, Mark cooked dinner. Claire did not stand beside him to guide him. She sat in the living room, reading the draft she was preparing for the seminar. From time to time, she heard the knife touch the cutting board, the water boil, Mark opening a drawer to find seasoning. At one point, he almost asked her something, then stopped himself, kept looking, and said quietly, "I found it." Claire smiled. After the meal, they stood by the window and watched the city lights come on. Denver stretched beneath the night sky, peaceful and wide. Mark handed Claire a cup of tea, not because she could not make it herself, but because this time, care did not come with the expectation of being served in return. It was only a small gesture, given in its truest form. He said, "I used to think fairness meant splitting everything in half." Claire watched the steam rise from the tea. "Fairness is not splitting things down the middle with a ruler," she said. "Fairness is seeing the whole picture: money, time, effort, emotions, the things that come with receipts and the things that never appear on any receipt." Mark nodded. He did not rush to add anything. He had learned that some of Claire's words needed to stand still without him explaining them, correcting them, or making them smaller. Claire leaned her shoulder against the window frame. She thought about the first night when the soup slowly cooled on the table, and she heard herself being treated as someone standing still in his life. She thought about the woman who had not screamed, who had not hurt anyone, who had not turned her pain into a war. That woman had only stepped back so everyone could see the part of the world she had once quietly held up. It was not revenge. It was a return to herself. Claire did not know whether the future would always be easy. No one knew. Mark could still make mistakes. She could still have days when the past returned. Margaret was still learning how to respect the new boundaries. Every family needed time to change habits that had lived too long, but Claire knew one thing for certain. She would not return to a life where love meant erasing herself. And Mark, if he wanted to keep walking beside her, would have to choose to see her not only in dramatic moments, but in every ordinary day, because love is not being cared for forever without ever noticing. Love is two people walking into the kitchen together, both seeing that the table needs wiping, both remembering that the bill needs to be paid, both asking whether the other is tired, and both choosing not to let anyone disappear so the other person can feel stronger. If Claire's story made you pause for a moment, perhaps it is because it reminds us that in a relationship, what matters is not only who earns more, who is busier, or who has a bigger role outside in the world. What matters is whether both people truly see each other's effort. There are tasks that never appear on a receipt, There are sacrifices that are never named. There are people who stay silent for too long, not because they are weak, but because they have been trying to keep everything peaceful. But a healthy relationship should not be built on the disappearance of anyone. This story is a fictional slice of life about respect, boundaries, and the way two people learn again what fairness truly means. If this message speaks to you, leave a comment saying, "I deserve to be seen." Do not forget to like, subscribe, and share this video with someone who may need to hear today's story. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story.